Caribbean Policy Development Center, in collaboration with the Institute of Gender and Development Studies, Nita Barrow Unit, and UETV, have partnered on a project titled Voices of Women, which seeks to highlight women from Barbados and the wider Caribbean, reflecting on their work in 5 areas: education, community development, development work, healthcare, and politics. Voices of Women play an integral part in ensuring that the oral history of the Caribbean woman is well remembered by allowing the chosen women to tell their stories from their views.
I am Billie Antoinette Miller, and I have formally retired in 2008. I did not lose my seat. Nobody pushed me out of it. It was a decision I took many years before that. You have to know in life sometimes when it's time to leave and let others. And I am very much for bringing other younger people on. So I retired in 2008. It is now 2017, mid-year, and in those intervening years, which will amount to 10 years in January next year, I find that I am working harder than when I was a working woman. I didn't have fixed hours even when I was a working woman, but working much harder, there was a time when I think I held more portfolios than any other minister in the history of cabinet government in Barbados, but I think I'm going to retire again. I really do. I need some time to myself, and there are things that I'm thinking I might want to write and so on. In my first term as a member of the cabinet, like I said, I was the youngest, I was the newest to the process and so on. I was the only woman. I didn't get a lot of discrimination as a woman. Like I said, I knew these men before. I knew a lot of them working at the bar, and generally I was a kind of roots person. I started in the Labour Party at the bottom. I wanted to get on to the National Executive Council of the party. And I remember one annual conference, walking about and asking for support. And some old fellows there said to me, well, who do France do you think you are? I mean, because your father was a parliamentarian one time, you think you could just come on to the NEC? I said, no, I'm prepared to work for it. I was living in St. James, as I do now. And Lionel Cragg was representing St. James. And I went to him and I said, Cragg, you don't have a constituency branch, you know, formally established in St. James. Do you mind if I try to organize one? I want to get onto the NEC, and so I would come on as a delegate from St. James. He said, man, I don't worry with anything like that. Cragg was something else. He said, man, I just had people vote Cragg and brag. That was a slogan one election for him, and it worked. Anyhow, I formed this thing, went up to the next annual conference, you know, as a delegate from St. James, you know, went around and then had to go around begging for votes and so on. Got a lot of pushback then, but I made it. So I got on there, and then I became an assistant general secretary, but the general secretary at the time, Mr. Clarence Demmett, refused to allow me to actually handle the minute book itself, so I had a separate notebook. But generally, that was the best time, because I was thinking then about, you know, how we could really strengthen the organization within the party. A lot of the men with whom I would interface practicing law at the bar in Barbados were sitting in the same cabinet. Bernard St. John, who was my Master in Chambers, Henry Ford, same Tom Adams, and several others as well, David Simmons, John Chatelain, quite a few, Lindsay Bolden, quite a few attorneys. You know, the lawyer politician is an animal known to politics everywhere in the world. It's a natural transition, I always think, from the practice of law to the making of laws. So it was lonely, because it was 18 years until 1994 when I saw two other women, both of whom I had mentored, walk up the steps of the House of Assembly. In those first two terms, there was a lot of social legislation that was passed. We started off by outlawing bastardy, and then we went right through up to the family law legislation, which virtually equates marriage with what used to be called common law marriage. We dealt with matters to do with succession, so that children born in a union other than a marriage, that's how it was described, could succeed. And there was a whole raft of other legislation, medical termination of pregnancy, which took 7 years of my life, building the case for it. And there were many times when I would have wished to have other women on the floor giving support to some of the things that I was putting forward. When I was in the Ministry of Education, we had just moved to co-ed, and there was still pushback out there, and I had to deal with that. I was already thinking, I'd arrived at the place where I thought that it was time that every head teacher, every school child should have a computer in front of them. Laptops were not yet invented, but that was an idea. And I remember when I invited the Prime Minister, Tom Adams, to come to the audiovisual aids, that was the only place that we could set up something that he could see. He was just blown away. He sat down in front of it, and he said, he looked at me, he said, I said, Prime Minister, he could hardly speak. I said, this is the future. In those days, we were very much ahead of the game, so to speak. We were readying people coming out of school to go into new jobs because new pillars were being added to the economy of Barbados. We find ourselves unhappily today, and it upsets me greatly. And I'm hoping to have quite a bit to say about that in time to come, I hope. We are now behind the game. We are preparing people who are sitting in the university as we sit here, preparing themselves for jobs which will have disappeared by the time they have graduated. And it's happening very quickly. We saw it happening before our eyes, but we just take things for granted. Automation, robotics has taken over. We had a company called Intel here. They wanted badly to stay in Barbados. But I think they wanted to go to a jurisdiction, a place in the world where it was less costly to run their operation. I think they tried the Philippines. They ended up in Costa Rica and totally changed that country. They're still there. We should never have let them leave. We have to look at the workforce, because you see what is the public discussion in Barbados now about the National Insurance Scheme. Now, that portfolio was given to me my first portfolio when I was Minister of Health. And that was because the idea that it was given to me, Tom Adams told me later, because I was the only person who spoke about health on the platform in the campaign. The men were talking about a whole host of other things. And the thing was to put a wellness benefit in the National Insurance Scheme. We have a scheme with a maternity benefit, with a death benefit, with a sickness benefit, but no wellness benefit. And that is the only way. We have looked at every possibility, the funding of it. This is the only way to do it from birth, as we do the national insurance from birth. It's taking care of you. And we have to look at the profile of mortality in Barbados and morbidity. In other words, what the NCDs are doing, the damage they're doing. Just look at the obituaries some Sunday mornings and I can tell. And we have got to look at the job opportunities which are likely to be available for the young people who will be coming out of the schools and the colleges. Before you can just go off with some crazy things, I do not wish to discuss them here or to even raise them here. I can't believe that grown men who should know better in both houses of our parliament are making the most outrageous suggestions about paying women to have children. It's unthinkable. Jack Deere called me one day and he said, we need a medical termination of pregnancy act of Parliament. We were seeing, and you would see it particularly on Friday nights and Saturday nights, the end result of abortions gone wrong. You only had to go to what used to be called the casualty, now it's A&E, accident and emergency, and you still see some of it, but not in the numbers that you used to see. And it wasn't so much only about that. The bill itself was about that, exclusively about that. But what the Barbados Family Planning Association was doing, and that's from the inception, was persuading women to plan their families. When I was a child, women would have 10 children, 12 children, 16 children. I remember, you know, you'd be walking in town or wherever with your mother, you would meet up her friends, the exhibition, wherever, and women always greeted each other, how are you? How are the children? How many children you have now? Always, always, whether it was walking about in St. George, campaigning, whatever, you know, with my parents, no matter where you were in society, the answer was always the same. X number dead and next number living. They would tell you the living number first. I have 7 living, but 3 died. In other words, infant mortality was high, I mean, beyond what could be deemed reasonable in those days. And so was maternal mortality. A lot of women died in childhood, in childbirth. And so that was the early work that they did. I think they were brilliant. When I became a thinking person and began to examine the reason why things were done, I thought it was brilliant that the early Barbados Family Planning Association reached out to men. And that was the wonderful work that the late Sir Clyde Gollop, and he was knighted for that work, that he did in communities. In those days, it was the beginning of the small industries that you were seeing. Barbados was going to small industries, which were mostly what we called screwdriver parts would come in. They would put things, assembly was what it was about. But there was the beginning now of these industrial parks. And so he would go in. He wasn't welcome. But he determined that the best time to go in was lunchtime, because they had to have a lunch hour. And that is when he would associate with the men and persuade them that they needed to be part of family planning as well. It was not something which they should leave exclusively for a woman to do. And that was great work. And we are seeing the benefit of that now. I'm not saying that we're still not seeing a lot of unplanned pregnancies and so on. But women will have different times of their lives when they determine that is a woman's right. That I am ready to have a child and I wish to have a child, but I want it to be done so that I'm advantaging my child and not disadvantaging. So all of that was the work. That's really been, that's where my life's work in the NGO world began. When he invited me to sit on the board of the Family Planning Association, and then in 1977 spoke to me about it might have been even in 1976, about legislation. Because doctors would have been willing to help many women who came to them literally bleeding to death. But by law, they would be putting themselves on the wrong side of the law. It wasn't right. Some doctors would reach out and help. Some felt that they didn't, especially if a woman was in an advanced state. They were rough, dark, bad days. And I readily agreed. I said, yes, I'll do it. We drafted a bill, not a very long one, but we took all the best advice from the doctors. So if you look at our act, there are 3 phases. What can happen in the first trimester, what can happen in the second, what can happen in the third. At least one doctor must verify in the first, 2 in the second, and in the third trimester, 3 or more. And there were grounds. But then I had to sell it to parliamentarians, and that was what took the time. Every parliamentarian on both sides of the floor, I personally sat down and went through it with. Every religious organization in Barbados, and there were many then, as there are now. I went to the top, or as near to the top as I could go. I spoke to the bishop, if there was a bishop. Even in the Catholic Church, I spoke to them all. It took time. I would walk with my documentation, explain it, trying to make them understand why this was necessary. And I had all the stats, the maternal mortality stats, the infant mortality stats, the morbidity that arose from difficult pregnancies, and so on. And that's how it came to be. Many, many, many years later, about, 10 years ago, maybe less, 8, I can't remember, university put out a call for papers, and they wrote me and asked if I would do a paper on the medical termination of pregnancy legislation. And I said, look, I have so many things, I had already retired, on my plate. This will need research now. I will have to go back and research and maybe talk to people again, and I would want to look at what today's position is, to do a comparative analysis and so on. They said, you need help? I said, yes, I would need help. Oh, they said, that's no problem. They gave me a research assistant, and she was brilliant, understood how my thought processes worked straight away. But she was also very busy, and so we would work together like on bank holidays. The open campus was very useful. There was an Englishman, I think, heading it up at that time, and he was very kind. He would let us have one of his rooms there, and that's how we did our work. We did it by way of an interview like this one, and I was able to tell her, where to go for research. There's a fantastic library in Parliament that Barbadians don't seem to realize. I think a lot of the people at the university should know that by now, but all of the laws of Barbados going way back are there, and a whole lot more as well. What they did was to look at Jamaica, Barbados, and Guyana. Barbados was a success story. It did pass Parliament. I had then moved to the Ministry of Education, because there was a lot of pushback even in my cabinet, in the cabinet in which I sat, before '81, when I was still Minister of Health and was ready with it. And you would hear, you're too close to an election, look, we're taking stick, meaning me, because I was getting a lot of stick now with the national insurance part of my portfolio, because I was seeking to introduce an unemployment benefit, and Barbadians were indignant. How dare you? We're not handicapped. I mean, we're to go begging now. And I explained it. So I was in potter, as we would say, both in the health, because the doctors were pushing back with the National Health Service, but I salvaged the drug service out of that, and they were pushing back with the unemployment benefit. Of course, nobody's pushing back today. They're all lining up for that now. But again, I feel vindicated. I know I was doing the right thing, but there was pushback. And then I found myself in the Ministry of Education from 1981. I said, okay, no excuses about election there. This issue is up. This is the beginning. We are going to do this. We must do this. You have agreed. But then there was a new Minister of Health. He was the late L.B. Brathwaite. He wasn't very keen, I think, on having to, he would have then to introduce it on the floor of the House. And Prime Minister Tom Adams said, well, I mean, Billie can introduce it. Oh, he said, no, I will definitely be introducing it. He didn't want to be bested by a little stripper of a woman, you know, because he was a mature man. And he did it really quite well. I spoke, of course, and I spoke from the point of view of the position that successive governments in Barbados had taken on women's health, going back to the post of public health officer. The public health inspector, who is now called an environmental health officer, was a much looked down upon and maligned person. They were exclusively men in those days, and they had a great big ladle. Those were the days when mosquitoes were spreading all of the communicable diseases. And I keep telling people, they don't want to believe it, but it's true. The public health officer today, up to this day in Barbados, has more power of entry into your home or my home or anybody's home in Barbados without a warrant. If a policeman wants to come to your house and you don't want him in, you are entitled to say, you have to show me a warrant. When the public health inspector comes, you have to open wide that door and let them in. These were the days when there were still a lot of pit toilets in Barbados. People didn't have running water at home, that sort of thing. And that was when the fight back started. And it was the woman who was in charge of that. So there's a long history. My father was the most influential person. Like I said, he took me everywhere with him. But my mother was part of that as well, because she would campaign with my father. And, you know, at Christmas when we were doing like gifts for people, I would go with her sometimes and that sort of thing. And when I was really little, I can remember the 1951 election, the first time that we had adult suffrage, and a lot of women like my mother. My mother was a trained nurse, General Hospital nurse and midwife. She married my father in 1943. I was born in 1944. The law giving women the vote for the first time in Barbados passed Parliament at the end, I think it was the beginning of December 1943. In those days, parliamentary elections used to happen every 2 years, not every 5 years, every 2 years. And so the next election was in 44, the year I was born. And so my mother was disadvantaged because she's married to my father now. In those days, when you worked in the old colonial civil service, so to speak, if you were teaching at a government school, if you were a nurse at the General Hospital and you got married, you had to resign. Oh yes, that was the end of your job. So my mother had neither property, nor money, nor a combination of the two. And that's what you had. The vote that was given to women in the end of 1943 was not full suffrage. It was qualified in that you had to have either of these two things. Men had to have it too. They had to have you had to have money to be able to vote. So ordinary working class people who couldn't afford to give away, in those days a man would work for 5 shillings a month. And that was a lot of money in the days of pounds and pence. So she was disadvantaged and she could not vote then. She had to wait then to 51 for adult suffrage to be able to vote for the first time. And I could remember that campaign in M22, red pickup, and my mother would be sized around. She didn't drive then, but in the driver's seat, Lady Adams would come and get in next to the seat, and I would be sitting between the two of them, and I would fall asleep either in one's lap or the other's lap. But this is before I went to Queen's College, where Lady Adams taught me geography. But women played a large role in my life. My father had a lot of sisters who were my aunts. They were powerful women. They worked from home. My father's father, my grandfather, Luther Gordon Miller the first, they lived on Reed Street right next to the Salvation Army. And even in the middle of Bridgetown, he had a dairy at the back of the family home there. But he had a donkey which somebody with a cart could use to bring, if it was crop time, you know, cane top cut in to feed the animals or other fodder for the cows to eat. And several of my aunts, at least 3 of them, ran dairies in addition to what their husbands were doing. They were independent women. They knew how to put a dairy up. I mean, Auntie Rosie lived next door to us, where I grew up in Brighton, and she had an actual milk house, you know, with shelves and so on, and cow stalls with these great big rings and so forth. So they were very independent women, and that is how they were. My mother taught me a lot of things. One of the early things she taught me, which I do to this day, even unto this morning, is how to make hospital corners when I make my bed. That was a very special mother-daughter time movement. Even my helper, she's given up on it. It's easy if you know, but that's to this day, that's how I make my bed. But she taught me a lot of other things about life. I remember one of the things I will never forget, in an emergency, and she knew this from her years as a nurse at the hospital. She said, in an emergency, don't panic first. You will recognize it when it's trying to take hold of you. Do that tomorrow. But you have to act now. But don't act foolishly. Think. But you have to, when you know you have to do something, yes. She taught me that, and I cannot tell you the number of times in my life that has come back to me. When I found myself in a position, my God, what am I going to do? And I can hear my mother's voice. Panic tomorrow. Act now.
Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed this program. Remember, you can watch this and all our programs on our website, www.uitv.org, available anytime, anywhere, and on any device. Also, join the conversation on social media by visiting our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages.